In the mid-20th century, European intellectuals faced an urgent task: understanding how society collapsed into totalitarianism and preventing mass suffering from repeating itself. The philosopher Theodor Adorno approached this problem through the lens of critical theory. He developed a rigorous materialistic analysis aimed directly at dismantling the economic and social structures that made fascism possible. You can see that meticulous academic focus in Adorno's own environment. He spent his life systematically tearing down the ideological justifications for oppression. Yet, despite his commitment to protecting the vulnerable, Adorno stated openly that he owed his greatest intellectual debt to one specific predecessor. That predecessor openly despised democracy. He rejected human equality, dismissed compassion as a sickness, and argued that the highest form of life was the raw, uninhibited exercise of power. It was the 19th century provocateur, Friedrich Nietzsche. How does a theorist dedicated to preventing fascism rely on the exact philosopher who celebrated ruthless supremacy? Adorno performed a theoretical inversion. He took Nietzsche's precise methods for diagnosing cultural decay, stripped away their aristocratic goals, and turned them against the exact systems of domination Nietzsche admired. The Enlightenment arrived with a specific promise: human reason, applied objectively, would banish myth and superstition, leading directly to universal freedom. But in 1944, Adorno and Max Horkheimer published The Dialectic of Enlightenment, arguing that this trajectory had entirely reversed itself. They identified a mutation they called instrumental reason. Rationality had been stripped of any moral objective. Under modern capitalism and expanding bureaucracies, reason was reduced to a tool for calculating efficiency, maximizing utility, and managing populations as raw resources. We can visualize this shift here. Pure reason, an illuminating force, hardens into a rigid, calculating grid, standardizing human behavior into uniform data points. Individual expression is systematically crushed. The drive for efficiency produces mass conformity, trapping people in a highly rationalized, barbaric system of control. Adorno did not invent this critique out of nowhere. Decades earlier, Nietzsche had already launched a massive attack on the Enlightenment's naive faith in objective truth and universal morality. Nietzsche argued that the Western desire to find absolute truth was actually a disguised will to power. It was a biological and psychological drive to classify the chaotic world, force order upon it, and dominate reality. Adorno accepted this diagnosis completely. Both men recognized that rationality is never a neutral, benevolent force. It is a weapon shaped by whoever holds power. Academic philosophy usually relies on the seamless, logical treatise. Thinkers built massive, unified systems of thought, but that format implies the world itself is coherent, rational, and just. Adorno called this identity thinking. It is the impulse to force messy, contradictory reality into artificial, rigid categories so it can be easily managed. To escape this, Adorno dismantled the structure of his arguments. The traditional, perfectly justified block of academic text shatters into isolated, disconnected fragments. This is the aphoristic method. By writing in short, single-sentence blocks without smooth transitions, he forces the reader to confront paradoxes directly. He borrowed this stylistic rebellion from Nietzsche, but Nietzsche used the aphorism as a hammer to shock his readers, aiming to liberate the rare, strong individual from the constraints of herd morality. Adorno adopted the form, but inverted the ethics. For him, a smooth, flowing text would hide the violence of modern bureaucracy. He wrote in fragments because that is how a damaged life actually feels. Instead of celebrating strength, Adorno uses the jagged edges of his text to preserve the memory of suffering. They both destroyed the traditional paragraph to break free from artificial logic. But where Nietzsche wanted to clear the path for the victor, Adorno used the wreckage to document the victims. This inversion is most obvious in how Adorno handles psychology. Nietzsche originally outlined the concept of resentment as the festering hatred experienced by the weak, who are powerless to strike back at their masters. We can track Nietzsche's model here. Aggression originates from the weak, bounces harmlessly off the strong, and curves inward, mutating into a fantasy of moral superiority. Nietzsche viewed this inward turn as a pathological process, generating a toxic slave morality that rejects instinct. Adorno took this psychological concept and applied it to material sociology. In his research for the authoritarian personality, he redefined ressentiment as displaced aggression. Adorno's flowchart shifts. Aggression from an oppressed class hits the untouchable ceiling of the capitalist system, but is caught by a mechanical gear, the culture industry, redirecting anger downward onto a scapegoat. This gear acts as a safe pressure valve, discharging frustration without threatening those in power. You can see this mechanism taking hold in the mid-20th century. Audiences absorbed mass media that allowed them to feel morally superior to villains on screen, draining their anger in a managed, passive environment. This mechanism also drives political jargon. When citizens use sanitized, conformist language, they find a linguistic loophole to safely express hostility toward excluded groups, all while appearing entirely normal. Adorno demonstrated that modern society doesn't cure ressentiment, it administers it. The once organic coping mechanism of the weak became a top-down tool for protecting the hierarchy. Ultimately, Adorno reached a hard limit with his predecessor. He delivered his most fatal critique by accusing Nietzsche of practicing immorality without a concept. Nietzsche was highly effective at tearing down the hypocrisy of bourgeois morality, but once those norms were destroyed, he offered no standard to distinguish between a genuine act of creative self-improvement and a brutal act of physical domination. Without a clear concept of justice beyond raw strength, a philosophy of power becomes highly vulnerable to catastrophic real-world application. Adorno insisted on a materialist alternative. Valid critique looks past destruction to identify a historically possible society free from exploitation, a goal requiring deep human solidarity. This leads directly to their irreconcilable split over the value of democracy. Nietzsche viewed mass society with absolute contempt. He saw the democratic demand for equality as an envy-driven illusion designed to drag the exceptional genius down to the level of the mediocre herd. Adorno held no illusions about capitalist democracy. He knew it was manipulative and economically unequal. Yet he practiced what he called a melancholy science, actively defending democratic institutions because they were the only proven framework capable of checking fascist violence. In the end, their relationship is an act of intellectual forging. Adorno could never have diagnosed the hidden cruelties of modern rationality without Nietzsche's hammer. But to survive the 20th century, Adorno had to take that hammer and strike back at the very domination Nietzsche revered.